I'm happy to be here with you all today. My name is Danielle Dick, and I direct the Rutgers Addiction Research Center, which is actually the largest comprehensive addiction research center in the country. We have over 150 researchers who span the entire translational spectrum, from basic science, neuroscience, genetics, through to epidemiology, etiology, prevention, intervention, treatment, recovery, policy. And my own personal work happens to be in the area of how genetic and environmental influences impact substance use outcomes. So my lab is called the Translational Addiction Genomics Lab, and we have a number of research projects going on. So I've been a researcher for over 25 years now, over $50 million in NIH funding. So it's been really a long-standing, large program of research. And I both run big gene identification projects where we are working on identifying the genes involved in why some people are more at risk than others. And then I have a number of longitudinal studies starting from early childhood all the way into later life, looking at what do individuals who are carrying at-risk genetic dispositions look like as they're growing up, what kinds of environments either increase or decrease risk. And then really what we do is aim to take all of that information and use it to design more tailored and hopefully effective prevention, intervention, and treatment. And so I'm going to be talking a little bit about really kind of stepping back, the current status of this literature and ways that I think it can be applicable to prevention and treatment even today. So I'm going to start with the most basic question, which is why. Why some people are more at risk than others? Why can some people drink socially or use drugs recreationally without developing problems, and for others it takes over their lives? And we know that part of the reason that some people are more at risk lies in our genes. So we know that substance use disorders are complex outcomes, in some ways no different than cardiovascular disease or type 2 diabetes, other kinds of things that we're used to working with in medicine. But they're complex in the sense that we know there are many genes involved, the environment plays a role. And so it's really this combination of our genes and our environments and how they come together that contribute to an individual's risk. But today, very often when we think about prevention, intervention, and treatment, we're focused on the environmental piece, on risk factors found in families, in neighborhoods, in peer groups. And those are obviously incredibly important pieces. I don't want anyone to come away from this thinking that I'm arguing we shouldn't be doing all of that. Absolutely, focusing on those social and environmental pieces is critical. But the issue is that we're leaving this other big part of the puzzle, this other big piece of why some people are more at risk, the genetic component, kind of on the table. And I really think that for something as complex as substance use disorders, that what we really want is to be using all of the tools in our toolbox. And so really what I hope to convince you of today is that we can take into account what we have learned about genetics and use that in our prevention, intervention, and treatment as well. So we can be addressing both the genetic and the environmental pieces to be thinking about how we treat the whole individual. So I'm going to focus today on what we've learned about genetic influences on addiction, what's the kind of current state of the field, and then some about how that information can be used to inform practice. So I've talked about how clearly both of these pieces are important, but we also know that there is no gene for substance use disorders. There's no gene for alcohol problems or opioid use disorder or depression or any of these other kinds of complex psychiatric and substance use conditions that most of us on this call, I'm guessing, are interested in and study. And one of the ways that we conceptualize this is with mental health jars. And so this is an example used by Dr. Janine Austin, a good friend. They're the world's leading expert on psychiatric genomic counseling. And essentially what they talk about is we all have a mental health jar. And the things that go into that jar that contribute to risk are environmental factors and genetic factors. And if you imagine, it's when that jar is full, that's when an individual is actively experiencing a substance use disorder or perhaps another psychiatric condition. We all start life with some genetic vulnerability. And so we can think of that as individuals who might have some genetic risk factors. We know that there's likely thousands of variants across our genome, each of which just play a small role in increasing or decreasing our risk. Some individuals are lucky. They start life with a low genetic disposition. Others are kind of in the middle. That's the majority of individuals. And we know that some individuals start life with a higher genetic risk. It's, of course, the luck of the draw in terms of the genes that we inherit. We're all at risk for something. For some of us, it's going to be cancers or cardiovascular diseases. And for others, it'll be substance use disorders. And then, of course, over time, what happens is we accumulate environmental risk as well. And that can lead to, for some individuals, their jar being full, meaning they're actively experiencing illness. And you can also see how you can start life with low genetic risk, but accumulate a lot of environmental risk to lead to problems. Or you can start life with a high amount of genetic risk, and then it doesn't take as many environmental risk factors to push individuals to the point where they're experiencing problems. But hopefully this model can also help you conceptualize how both prevention and recovery are possible, meaning that an individual can have a full jar. They can be experiencing an active episode of substance use disorder, but we can essentially remove some of those environmental risks, and we can add protective factors. So our jar essentially gets bigger, and it takes more for an individual to eventually be experiencing problems. And of course, every one of us has a different mental health jar. We all have a different genetic vulnerability that we've started life with. We all have different sets of environmental risk and protective factors. And so one of the things that we've really been working on in this field is helping to figure out what are the pieces that can go into that jar and contribute to risk. And the reality is that different people can start life with different genetic predispositions. And so by that, I mean, if you imagine that there are potentially thousands of genetic factors that increase risk, locations in our genome that can increase risk, it doesn't take all thousand of them for an individual to be genetically at risk. You might have a different subset or combination of those risk factors in your jar. And of course, this maps on to the clinical observation that people use substances for very different reasons. What many of us in this field are working on right now is essentially scanning the genome to identify the specific locations that can increase risk. And we call this genome-wide association studies. So what we're really able to do is to genotype 1 million or more locations across the genome. And by markers, what I essentially mean is we're looking at, does a person have version A or version B? And so if we think of, flashback to basic biology, the 4 base pairs that make up DNA, we might be asking, does someone have an adenine and somebody else have a guanine at that location, right? What is the genetic variant they're carrying at that location? We're scanning the entire genome to look at different genetic variants. And then what we can do with that information by identifying the genetic locations that increase risk, it can both help us understand the underlying biology. What are those genes and what are they doing? And that can help us with drug development and treatment. I work with many colleagues who are working on that piece of things. I'm not going to talk a ton about it today, but it's obviously an active and ongoing area. And the other piece is that by knowing what are these underlying risk factors and how they influence risk, we can also use that for prevention to get ahead of problems before they start. And really, these tenets are the basics of what make up what's sometimes called the precision medicine initiative. It's precision medicine or personalized medicine. This was really announced in 2015 by President Obama as part of the State of the Union address. And the whole idea is that we are making such radical advances in genomics and other areas that we can move beyond a one-size-fits-all approach to medicine. So we can essentially take medicine from a treatment-based model to one that is more predictive, personalized, and preventative. So right now, most of us go to the doctor or show up at a substance use clinic, et cetera, when there is a problem. Maybe some of us are really good and we go in and do our annual checkups or whatnot, but most medical appointments are when there is a problem. The idea here is that our genomes contain a ton of information about what we're at risk for. So we could essentially use that to get in front of problems before they develop. There have been billions of dollars that are essentially being spent now on what is sometimes called and was signed into law as the 21st Century Cures Act. It received strong bipartisan support. When does that happen anymore? And a lot of these funds are going toward a major national project called All of Us. So All of Us is an effort to enroll 1 million diverse individuals across the United States and to essentially collect a wealth of information. So genomics, but other wearables and, and data that can be collected from digital technologies, health records, surveys collected across time. And essentially this huge data set is going to really be accompanied or be kind of the United States contribution to what is a really global effort. So there are already massive biobanks that exist in the UK, in Finland, in Iceland, growing biobanks in Africa, et cetera. And the idea is that by collecting all of this data and then applying, big data methods, data science, we can essentially do better classification and diagnosis, and this will allow us to do better prevention and intervention. And so in a paper that was published in Science by the then director of the National Institutes of Mental Health a few years ago, we know that our patient population, so when it comes to treating substance use disorders, we know that we have an incredibly heterogeneous group of people who meet criteria for a substance use disorder. And they likely differ in their genetic risk profile, but we can also do things like look at brain activity, physiology, behavioral profiles, life experiences. And the whole idea is by collecting this really, huge wealth of information from millions of individuals, what we're going to be able to do is identify clusters of individuals who share similar profiles. And this will allow us to do better treatment and early intervention. And so in this paper, they essentially said, new diagnostics are going to redefine psychiatric and addictive disorders as brain circuit disorders. And new pharmacological and behavioral interventions will focus on fine-tuning these circuits. Now, I want to pause for a moment and say that if this all sounds like science fiction to you, you're in the trenches, you're working on treating substance use disorders, this feels like a far off impossibility. I want to take you back less than 25 years ago when they were talking about, less than 30 years ago now, when they were talking about this crazy concept called the internet.
Back in 56 past, I wasn't prepared to translate that. As I was doing that little tease.
Oh, that's
that
right.
Little mark with the A and then the ring around it. At. See, that's what I said.
Mm-hmm.
Katie said she thought it was about.
Yeah. Oh.
But I'd never heard it.
Around.
I'd never heard it said. I'd always seen the mark, but never heard it said. And then it sounded stupid when I said it. Violence at NBC.
I would be around or about in the lunchroom.
See, there it is. Violence at NBC, GE.com. I mean,
Well,
What-
Allison should know. What
What
do you
is
say about
internet anyway?
Internet is that massive computer network, the one that's becoming really big now.
What do you mean? That's big. Wait, how does one not? What do you write to it like mail?
No, a lot of people use it and communicate. I guess they can communicate with NBC writers and producers. Allison, can you explain what internet is?
So think about that. Less than 30 years. What is the internet? It was this crazy thing scientists were talking about. And now, of course, what we have is an entire generation growing up, not ever knowing a world before we had, the world's knowledge at our fingertips in the form of cell phones. It's changed the way that our kids are growing up. It's changed the way that we vote. It's changed our entire society in ways that nobody was imagining 30 years ago. And what led to this rapid change is exponential growth, which our brains, which have evolved over hundreds of thousands of years to think very linearly, really just can't wrap our heads around. The only field that is advancing at a pace that outpaces the advances that we've seen in computing is genomics. And so what this figure shows is this line here is what's referred to as Moore's Law. It was an observation made in the 60s by the co-founder of Intel, Gordon Moore, who observed that they were able to double the number of transistors per square inch of a computing chip every other year. And that is the exponential growth that computing experienced. And that's how we went from what is the internet to the world at our fingertips in the form of something, this big that we can carry around in our pockets. Now, this line is how quickly that advance was happening, Moore's Law. You can see that it looks linear, even though I just said it's exponential, because the axis here is going from 1 to 10 to 100 to 1,000,000. This is an exponential axis. The only thing that's outpacing that across any field of science is genetic technology. So this massive drop-off, this extremely fast exponential growth, is the advances in genotyping technology. It's the drop in cost of genotyping. So consider that the human genome, the first human genome, was published in 2003. It took 13 years and almost $3 billion to sequence one human genome, one person's genome. Now we can do that with about $100 in less than a day. 13 years, $3 billion, $100 less than a day. That's exponential growth. Consider it was only in the 50s that we even discovered the structure of DNA. And now genetic testing is an $18 billion market and is expected to reach $36 billion by the end of this decade. There's also exponential growth that we're seeing in the direct-to-consumer genetic industry. And so this is essentially showing the number of people that have accessed their personal genomes through direct-to-consumer, through Ancestry.com, 23andMe, etc., also showing exponential growth. There were publicly available websites. ImputeMe was one of the most popular ones, where you could upload your raw genotypic data from Ancestry or 23andme.com, and you could then get access to your personalized genetic risk score for over 1,500 biomedical conditions. This shows how there was exponential growth in the number of people doing that. It turns out that the third most requested genetic risk score out of 1,500 was alcohol use disorder, the only substance use disorder that was available through the platform. Psychiatric and substance use disorders made up half of the top 12 most requested genetic risk scores. people want access to this information, and many of them are already getting it. Turns out Impute Me isn't publicly available anymore. It's now gone private, and they're working on building it out as a for-profit industry. So with that by way of background, I want to talk a little bit about where we are in terms of actually understanding the genetics of addiction. So I lead a large consortium of investigators from around the world. We had a paper published in Nature Neuroscience a couple years ago. It included over 1.5 million individuals. And essentially what we were doing is scanning the genome to look for genes involved in general addiction propensity. And so this is the whole testing markers all the way across the genome, identifying those that are associated with risk. And really the way that we do this is we just go marker by marker, run, 1 million tests and then do a massive multiple testing correction. And essentially we're looking for areas where individuals who are affected are more likely to carry a particular version at that location in the genome than others, telling us it looks like there's something about this location in the genome that's increasing risk. Then we find all of these thousands of locations. And what we can essentially do then is sum them up into what's called a polygenic score, PGS. You sometimes hear them called PRS, polygenic risk scores. And essentially what it is it's summing up for any individual how many of those risk locations they're carrying, along with how big of an effect size is associated with each one. And then you're reducing out how many protective factors they might have as well to create an overall score of that individual's propensity toward addiction. So to give you an idea of what this looks like, what we have done here is essentially group people into quintiles. So over here on the left, these are individuals who have the lowest levels of genetic risk, all the way up here to, at the right side, individuals who have the highest levels of genetic risk. And this is essentially showing for looking at moderate alcohol use disorder. So you can see the top line here is of individuals with the lowest levels of genetic risk. Just under 30% at some point meet criteria for moderate alcohol use disorder, whereas among individuals at the highest levels of genetic risk, nearly 50% of them do. Looking at something like use of opioids without a doctor's prescription. So you can see that about 13% of individuals in the lowest levels of genetic risk report using opioids in non-prescribed ways, whereas close to 30% of individuals at the highest levels of genetic risk do. We also took those genetic risk scores into electronic health records. This was at Vanderbilt, has a huge biobank. And essentially what we did is we said, okay, those genetic risk scores are associated with what medical outcomes in this huge hospital system. And all of these dots are essentially medical outcomes that were significantly associated with this elevated risk for addiction propensity. And you can't read all the details here, but really what I want you to take away from this is that in addition to the expected associations with substance use disorders and related psychiatric disorders, we also find high associations with things like suicide risk. But individuals who had higher polygenic scores showed worse health in nearly every bodily system. So they were more likely to suffer from heart disease, HIV infection, type 2 diabetes, obesity, cirrhosis of the liver, lung cancer. And of course, what is probably immediately becoming obvious to you is that these are medical outcomes that are mediated by behaviors related to self-regulation. So how much an individual smokes, drinks, has unprotected sex, uses drugs, overeats. And so really what I hope this, helps us do is rethink what it means to be genetically at risk for substance use disorders. Because really it challenges this idea that individuals are carrying genes for substance use disorders specifically. In fact, I find that one of the biggest misconceptions when I talk about genetic influences on substance use disorders, I find a lot of people are like, yes, now there's, more widespread understanding that we do differ in our genetic risk and our propensity to substance use disorders. They do have an underlying biological component, but most people think that that is physiological, that it's our genes influence in how our bodies are going to respond to a drug, with the idea that some people have a more addictive response to a particular drug. And some of that is true. There are genes that influence the way our bodies respond to alcohol, to opioids, to nicotine, etc. But that is actually just a very, very small part of the genetic risk that influences substance use outcomes. In fact, the much larger genetic risk is via what we sometimes call externalizing. It's related to how our brains process risk and reward, immediate versus long-term consequences. It's related to things like sensation seeking, impulsivity. And then the other genetically influenced risk pathway is related to how our brains are wired to process anxiety or fear. This shows up in worry, anxiety, depression, which can of course lead using substances to essentially normalize or ameliorate some of those feelings. And so it turns out that the bigger genetic component to why some of us are more at risk for substance use disorders than others, it isn't just related to the way our bodies respond to drugs. It's actually far more related to the way our brains are wired. And I want to point out that this is good and really helpful information from a prevention intervention standpoint, because we know things like impulsivity show up very early. It's not like one of the things I think is fascinating about studying substance use disorders is, no one wakes up one morning and discovers they've had an onset of opioid use disorder, an onset of alcohol use disorder. Instead, it's generally a trajectory of risk-related behavior, which means there's opportunity to intervene. So impulsivity shows up in little kids they're the ones that are dangling from trees, giving their parents heart attacks, ending up in the ER a lot. And we know that this very child, if you fast forward a decade, is much more likely to be this individual, but not necessarily. There's no reason that same genetic disposition can't be channeled into this or into this. And for full disclosure, this little risk taker is actually my little risk taker, who comes by it very honestly. His father, my brother are all, in fact, fighter pilots, which I think brings us to an important point in how we think about and shape the conversation surrounding genetic influences on substance use disorder as well. When we know that part of it is physiological, it's how our bodies respond to a drug, okay, we can't influence that. Hopefully that's not something that people would blame others for in terms of when we think about stigma surrounding substance use. But the fact that the other major component is the way brains are wired, things like sensation seeking and risk taking are not bad things in and of themselves. Fighter pilots, CEOs, entrepreneurs tend to be higher in risk taking. Those characteristics can also make one more at risk for substance use disorders, but that's definitely not a set outcome, right? So one of the things that we have really been thinking about is, how do we take all this information? How can we use this to essentially incorporate this genetic component about the underlying ways in which our genes are influencing outcomes, and we can incorporate that into our prevention, intervention, and recovery efforts as well. Because the reality is, if you just address the substance use problem that's right in front of you and not the underlying risk factors, not talking about the extent to which it might be impulsivity, sensation seeking, or a propensity toward fear and worry, things that are related to the way an individual is wired, then those same tendencies can show up in other ways. So for individuals who might be higher in risk taking, they might not be using substances, but it might be showing up then in gambling or in risky sex or in overeating and other kinds of ways. So when we think about not just what are the environmental components, it's critical we address those, but what are also the underlying dispositional components, and how do we have conversations about that, and how individuals can essentially think about the good pieces of that and the not so good pieces and put in place plans to address some of those potential other outlets which might be problematic. Then, really we're not addressing the whole individual in our treatment or recovery plan. And I want to mention that this also isn't just hypothetical. We're actually working right now on how can we put this research into practice? How can we make it easy for individuals to access this information and then to act on it? Because one of the things that I do is I speak to thousands of parents. I do a lot of substance use prevention programming. And the thing that they say to me so frequently is, I wish I could know. I wish I could know if my child will be the 1 in 5 who goes on to develop a substance use disorder, or 1 in 4 who goes on to develop any problem with addiction once you take into account gambling, gaming, other behavioral addictions. I wish I could know. And I would think to myself, you can. We have learned so much, both about the genetics and the environmental piece of things. We can help people understand what's in their jar, essentially. And so actually, we're actively working right now with funding from the National Institute of Drug Abuse on building an online platform in which individuals fill out a short survey. They spit in a tube in the privacy of their homes that gets sent off to a lab for genotyping, and we incorporate both genetic and behavioral and environmental risk to deliver personalized risk profiles. These are based on 20 years of research, as I mentioned, more than $50 million in NIH funding. But we don't just want to tell someone they're at risk. We then connect them with evidence-based resources to reduce risk. And so we're working on building all of this out in an easy online platform. We're actually going to be inviting people to take part in that, and enroll people and do follow-up to see how effective it is and how we can better improve it coming up in the spring. Because the reality is that our dispositions are not destiny, or what we sometimes say, your genes are not your fault and they're not your fate. But they're also not something to be ignored. We all have natural tendencies. I sometimes say it's easier when you work with Mother Nature rather than against it. You can lament the fact that you are a more impulsive, risk-taking person, or you can think about what are the good pieces that come along with that, and what are the not so good pieces. And I'm very passionate about how we can get research out to the public. I actually have a public-facing website too here with a variety of resources that you might find useful. They're here on this tab. And one of the things that's there is a survey which taps into 4 genetically influenced dispositions, 2 on the externalizing side that I talked about, kind of impulsivity and sensation seeking, and 2 on the internalizing side, so hopelessness and then also anxiety or worry. And you can use this as a starting point for discussions with your clients about what are some of the underlying risk factors that they might carry? What are some of the things that they see in terms of their tendencies that might be contributing to some of the problems? So what I hope that you will come away from this is that genetics is clearly an important piece of what influences substance use disorders that we often overlook or don't think deeply about when we are doing prevention, intervention, and treatment. And our understanding of how our predispositions influence risk, what those pathways of risk are via externalizing, internalizing, and physiological response. By understanding those pathways of risk, we can do more tailored prevention, intervention, treatment, and support recovery. This is where you can find free resources that I put out about substance use. One of the things that I also did in my pandemic project is that I wrote a book for parents. It's really about how much of kids' behavior is genetically influenced and how we can use that in our parenting to reduce some of our frustrations and essentially support kids in who they are and accentuating their strengths and reducing some potential pitfalls associated with different dispositional styles. I would be happy to take any questions that you have. Thank you.
I see in the chat, Eleanor has a question for you. Will the genetic testing only reveal propensity for substance use disorder or also mental health diagnoses?
That's a great question. So the Psychiatric Genomics Consortium is a large international group which is working on gene identification across all kinds of psychiatric and substance use disorders. And so I personally happen to work on the substance use disorders piece, but there have also been really, tremendous advances in understanding depression. Anxiety is still a little bit further behind, but we are first essentially, if you're talking about the platform that we're building out, what we're focusing on first is the genetic risk associated with a broad propensity toward addiction. And that's based on the work that I've led that I mentioned before.
Oh my gosh, no.
And essentially what the reason we're focused on that first is because that is the most predictive genetic score to date. So it predicts about 10% of the variance in outcomes. For other areas, it's much more like 2 to 5%, but certainly our plan is to incorporate other mental health conditions into genetic risk profiles as well. We're just kind of starting with addiction propensity, and once we get it off the ground, then the hope is to be able to further tease apart some of these other areas as well.
Any other questions for Danielle, Dr. Dick?
I have another question. So I maybe missed a couple of words that you said, but you were saying that like through Ancestry.com and I can't remember the other one, 21andMe or something like that. So I belong to Ancestry.com, and sometimes they do some of these surveys or questionnaires about things that don't seem like they would go together, but I think it's probably something like what you're talking about. So are you getting information from those places as well for your
Yes.
studies?
So 23, so I'm not sure exactly about Ancestry.com, but 23andMe, which is one of the largest genetic testing for a whole series of health outcomes, you're right that they absolutely do send surveys out and say, participate in research. And I will tell you that they charge researchers for that, and then they sell the data to researchers. And so, but they have a huge bank of individuals with genotypes. And so it actually, we do partner with them. It's because they have a lot of information, but they charge us for that. And I personally, so I will tell you that the platform I'm working on building out, we're actually working with another company to try and commercialize this and bring this to people at scale. And the co-founders of this group are, they both lost their fathers to alcohol use disorder. So they're very passionate about it from a, how do we do the greatest good and how do we bring it to people? So it is help people first, not make money first. And that's obviously a different model than many companies have. So 23andMe, a big part of their model is that they sell the genotypic data to pharmaceutical companies and they charge researchers to access the data. And they don't allow researchers then to make the results publicly available, which is something that we do in the research community because we need these huge sample sizes to be able to really, have sufficient power for complex outcomes like substance use disorders and psychiatric outcomes. And so, as you can tell, I have mixed feelings about, that commercializing of health genotypes and as a commodity. And so one of the things that in this startup that I'm involved in would be a promise to individuals that you could be a part of the research, but we're not going to sell the information to other companies, because we would love to have people participated in a way that they get the information, they can benefit from it, and they can contribute to research so that we can kind of all do this together. In my job as director of the Rutgers, one of the things that we're also implementing is what we call the research community partnership. And so essentially we're looking at creating an online clearinghouse, if you will, of individuals who want to be a part of research related to substance use disorders. So it could be individuals who are affected themselves, could be family members, could be anyone who cares about this. And then the whole idea is, let's create a community of individuals who want to be a part of research projects. And so you could be invited, for example, to be part of a genetic study or part of a brain imaging study or part of a, social determinants of health kind of study. And then we would take all those findings and send them out to people too. So you could keep up with what are the latest advances in understanding substance use disorders and the new research and events and talks and things that are going on. So that's another thing that we're really working on getting off the ground right now too, that then we want to, open up broadly to anyone who's interested in being a part of this. So, so that's kind of the relationship between some of these companies and then some of these other pieces that I'm working on as well. Other thoughts or feedback or questions?
Another question just came through from Shannon. Actually two. What findings have you discovered about how trauma experiences interact with a person's genes?
Yeah, that's a great question. And so one of the things that I study and many other folks is really this gene environment interaction, how these pieces come together. And what we see is sometimes it can be kind of additive effects, as I talked about in that sort of jar model, right? You might have genetic risk, and then you might have traumas, and that might essentially kind of add up to an individual experiencing problems. But we also know that environmental experiences can kind of trigger genetic dispositions too, or reduce the likelihood that a genetic predisposition is going to be expressed on the opposite end, if you think of, for example, protective family environments. And so one of the, I think, the easiest ways to think about this is, if you have no access to alcohol, then you're never going to develop an alcohol use disorder. It doesn't matter what your genotype is. And so in that sense, the environment has really trumped genetic effects. But then you can imagine a sliding scale of, for example, we find that in adolescents who have parents that are highly monitoring, that ask them, where are you going and what are you doing and who are you with? That if you look at what influences how much kids are using substances, that in families where there's high parental monitoring, the role of genetics is very low. It's mostly the environment that's impacting whether or not kids are using. Among families where there's very low levels of parental monitoring, there's more disengaged parents, then, kids have more opportunity to express those genetic dispositions, which means that kids who are more at risk are more likely to be using substances. And so we see that their genetic dispositions are playing a much bigger role in whether they are using and developing problems. There's still going to be those kids who aren't genetically at risk, and maybe it's not, as important that their parents aren't as monitoring. So it's that interaction between the kid's genotype and their environment. We know that trauma can be a particularly salient environment, and obviously there's a whole range in that sense as well too. And so, I sometimes talk about the fact that heritability, when we say overall about 50% of the risk for substance use disorders is due to genetics. That doesn't mean in any one individual, 50% of the reason they develop problems is due to their genes and the other 50% is due to their environments. That 50% or heritability is a population statistic, meaning that if we're talking about the differences that we see between people in how much they drink, how much they use other drugs, their likelihood of developing problems, that's due to differences between them in their DNA sequences. And so for one individual, it might be that lower levels of trauma, or a trauma that someone else might objectively look at and say, well, that's not as big of a deal. As we know, trauma is personal to the individual, but something that might be perceived as a lower level trauma actually could be enough if they're genetically at risk to really, push them into developing problems. Other individuals might have low genetic risk, but experience, a large trauma or a lot of trauma, and that might be the primary driver in their substance use. And so that's where I kind of get at, we all have different mental health jars. We all have some degree of genetic risk and some degree of environmental risk. And so drilling down into what are the environmental factors and what are the genetic factors for any one individual, because it's going to be a unique combination. So hopefully, there's not a single answer to how trauma affects individuals because of this. How the trauma is perceived is also going to be related to the individual's genetic disposition. Now I can better see you all as well too.
Anybody else have a question or comment for Dr. Dick?
Oh, now I can actually see the chat as well too. So
Okay.
I see there's a question about, is there an audio version of the book? Yes, you can access both a hard copy and audio through Amazon or through my website, thechildcode.com.
I have a question. It's one thing, and a lot of what you said was super interesting. So thank you for sharing all of this information and your research. One thing that you mentioned that I found particularly interesting was how your research, can lend to kind of understanding how we do healthcare differently. And I'm just curious what you might hope for or anticipate with this kind of research, maybe changing the way that we do healthcare, right? Like you said, a more individualized, maybe approach to taking care of people's health and substance use treatment, just because I feel like it's such a politicized, unfortunately, like, topic in our countries, specifically about, medical care and all that stuff. So I'm just curious, like, what would maybe be your hopes or kind of end goals with, in particular, with that aspect of your research?
It's a great question. It's a big question, of course. So where I think we're going, let me talk a little bit about where I think this is going with or without us, which is that if you look at those exponential growth curves and think about the fact that our brains just can't even fathom what exponential growth in an area does, in the same way I talked about with computing. So the exponential growth curve for computing started in the 60s. And then where it really started, we started seeing it is mid-90s to today, right? The exponential growth curve for genetics started in the early 2000s. So figure we're about 40 years behind, but now it's, we are essentially, now it's people are talking about it, right? And so what I think is that parallel to computing, we are going to see changes that right now feel like science fiction. The clip I didn't show, which I sometimes do when I'm giving talks, is I'm curious if anyone's willing to kind of by show of hands using the little feature there about whether they've seen the movie Gattaca from the mid-90s. It came out in 97, which was the year I graduated from college. And, in the beginning, you might recall there was a scene where, Ethan Hawke is saying, it used to be 10 fingers, 10 toes. That was all that mattered. Now, from the moment of my, birth, they know what my health outcomes are going to be. And I mean, they get a lot of things wrong. They say they know the moment of my death, right? Okay, nobody's going to know that. But the nurse is reading out from a drop of blood from DNA, 30% chance of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, 90% chance of heart disease, 50% chance of manic depression. If you think about what I presented today, with this genotype, 50% chance of substance use disorder, we are right now at that, what was science fiction 30 years ago. Now we are at have you heard about this crazy new thing called the internet? Oh, have you heard about these things that they're doing with genetics now? So I really think that fast forward another 30 or 40 years, I have that little, toddler hanging from the trees is now a teenager. I think that in his lifetime, we are all going to have access to our genomes. All of our genomes, I think, in the next generation will be sequenced. It will be a part of our medical records. We can think about all of the things that's good for, that's scary for. I think we need to be having all these important ethical conversations surrounding it. There are many people that are thinking a lot about it, but I think it's coming with or without us, because if you look at, and it's being driven a lot by private industry, I actually think private industry is going to be where many of these things happen first. Our healthcare system is it's like the Titanic, right? We're trying to move it and it's moving really slow and it's cumbersome. But I think a lot of the innovation will come from industry, and then it will become commonplace and everyone will want it, and it will spill over and drive the public sector, et cetera, as has happened with so much in computing. So if we just assume, as I do, that that's where we're going, then what do I think we need to do to get from here to there? I think we need to think very carefully about how do we optimize that for good. And when it comes to substance use disorders, it means things like, one, we need far more understanding and education about what genetic risk for substance use disorders is and isn't. And that's why I talk some about this and about how it isn't necessarily bad things too. It's the way brains are wired, and there's good that can come along with that. It can be your secret superpower in addition to leading to potential pitfalls. So how do we, accentuate the potential, reduce the potential pitfalls? So I think we need far more education surrounding that, about what complex genetics is, about how it's not determinative. It's, it is an elevated risk of an outcome, but it is definitely not destiny. That's not the genetics that we get in high school biology, right? We get brown eyes and blue eyes and Punnett squares and pea pods. Nobody's talking about how cardiovascular disease, substance use, mental health, that it's thousands of genes and they increase and decrease a little bit. And then it's the environment, and the environment can change your genetic risk. So I think we need more widespread education, and that has to get out through a variety of ways. And I think that we need greater understanding about how genetic influences impact things like addiction. That'll, I think, also work to hopefully curbing and continuing to reduce stigma. I think that then what we need are the evidence-based practices that can get, essentially attached to individuals who are genetically at elevated risk. So my hope is one day we've all got our genomes sequenced. We know what we're at risk for. So we know, okay, this is a child, for example, who's going to be wired to be more impulsive. How do we essentially teach self-regulation skills from an early age, and then talk about the fact that, they could be more at risk when substances come online. You're maybe not going to be able to use substances in the same way as your friends. What are other outlets? How we can, tailor that toward other amazing things, that they can embrace it as strengths and not as a weakness, or I'm, carrying this genetic deficiency. That's not how this works. And so that's really where I hope we're going. And that's why I'm working on some of these. How do we actually build out things that can get to people? Start studying what's most effective in terms of how we present the information, how we match people to resources. One of the things that you didn't ask, but I'll use this opportunity to throw out too, is that one of the things people worry about is when you're told you're at lower genetic risk, especially because a lot of my work is with emerging adults, do people then go crazy and think like, well, great, I can never develop a problem? We actually find no evidence that that's the case, that even people who are given lower genetic risk estimates report intentions to reduce their drinking. There's this nice linear effect where if you're given the highest levels of genetic risk, like 80% of people say that they're going to reduce their drinking. In the middle, it's something like 60%, but it's something like 40 to 50% who are at low risk also say they're going to reduce their drinking. Only 2 to 3% of people say they're going to increase. And that's across all the feedback, right? That's something about those individuals. But for most people, even just talking about it and the fact that genes contribute to these outcomes seems to be associated with making healthier choices. So I am, as you can see, optimistic that we can use this for good in the future and to prevent problems. But I also think we need to do it in a careful and thoughtful way to be addressing all the ethical implications.
You're on mute, Eleanor.
Thank you. I remember there was many years ago, there was something about getting tested for something, and like genes, and people were worried that then they might not be able to obtain insurance, or they might not be able to get jobs because it would be known that they were at high risk for certain health disorders or whatever. So how does that seem to be working into this?
Yes. So there's the GINA Act, the Genetic Information Non-Discrimination Act. It protects against some things, right? So you can't use it to, so you can't use genetic information to discriminate for example, health insurance, for jobs, I think for a variety of things. But I will tell you, it doesn't cover everything. So it doesn't cover, for example, life insurance. And so I think that as this becomes more commonplace, unfortunately, I wish I thought that our policies would get in front of things, but as you know, we tend to have a history to be coming behind all the advances. Of course, we're seeing this now with respect to, regulations surrounding AI and regulations surrounding computing and all kinds of things. I would love to think we can get in front of some of it with genetics, but I also think some of it will come alongside and perhaps behind all these advances. So there are some protections in place. I think they need to be better. Because some people are concerned about this too, I also think that's one of the reasons that direct to consumer can be beneficial, because you can get it from, obviously you want to be careful about the company that you are sending your information to. But for example, as we are thinking about like, how would we bring some of this direct to consumer to people? Some individuals are saying, actually, I'd prefer to do it that way, because then I know it's not going to end up in my health records, because there is still some uncertainty and, how people will use it. Will people understand it? As an aside, as I'm sure you all know, many medical doctors and health professionals say, they feel very uncomfortable with all the advances in genetics and don't know how to handle it and keep up with it and all of those kind of things. I mean, who would, right? It's hard because it's advancing so rapidly. So other things that are in the works, I should just mention, are updating like our electronic health record systems to have more warnings, educations, like more, to make it more automated. So if, for example, someone is getting blood work done, and you could imagine, extrapolate, one day somebody's gotten their genotype, their sequences in their electronic health records, and they show up, and and there's a child that's, maybe parents are saying, oh, there's, I'm having a lot of trouble or something. There could be a flag that says, okay, actually there's a disposition toward impulsivity. Here are things to do, right? Like, talk to parent, give them these resources, talk to them about this isn't their fault. They're not doing something, quote, wrong. Here are ways to support parents. Here's ways to support the kids. Here's strategies. For other kinds of conditions, you could imagine, here are medications that you might consider talking to them about. So it pops, the physician or the provider is not responsible for carrying all that information. It'll become more automated. And we're already working on a variety of those things. The first places it's coming with is with pharmacogenomic testing in there, right? Where there could be an alert to say, ooh, don't give this person this drug, or they might need a larger or smaller dose. And so I see that getting expanded out to a variety of other things as well, too, in our health records. But yes, sorry, I realized I took a tangent from is it going to be used for discriminatory purposes? Those are some of the benefits, I think, to direct to consumer. But as it is integrated more into our healthcare system, I think that there's a whole series of things that are going to have to happen, from policy to helping support clinicians with that.
So Dr. Barnett also made a comment about, thank you for your presentation, excellent information. And then he went on to ask, has the research shown any correlation between genetic profile, traumatic brain injury, and subsequent development of substance use disorders?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I'm not aware of research that specifically looks at exactly that question of, might this be another environmental trigger, or how might it interact with genetic dispositions? Of course, one of the things that we know is that, brain injuries can affect executive function, ability to think through long-term consequences, how your brain works. And those are some of the things that we know are also genetically influenced, and that impact why some people are more at risk than others. And so you could imagine that actually could be an alternate pathway to end up with a brain that is functioning in a way that might, for example, discount immediate consequences, or not be as prone to thinking through long-term consequences and some of the things that we know put individuals at risk. So I actually don't know of research that looks at, are there specific interactions between genetic risk and traumatic brain injury? But I know that some of the ways that you see the brain damaged can result in traits that can be genetically influenced too, that can increase risk. Thanks for all these really interesting and questions.
Any other thoughts or comments, questions? I think that's probably it. Thank you so very much, Dr. Dick.
Absolutely. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you all. Have a great day. And as I mentioned, you can find a variety of resources on my website. Let me know if there's anything else that would be useful.